All right. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Morgan, and I'm an event coordinator at Politics and Prose, and I'd like to welcome you all to PNP Live. First, I will drop the link in the chat where you can purchase Ida Be the Queen straight from PNP's website, and a reminder that we're offering shipping on all orders. You can ask our speaker a question by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can toward the end of the program, but we apologize in advance if we don't have time to address your question. Let's introduce tonight's guest. Michelle Duster is a writer, speaker, professor, and champion of racial and gender equity. In the last dozen years, she has written, edited, or contributed to 11 books. She co-wrote the popular children's history book, Tate and His Heroic Dream, co-edited Shifts in Michelle Obama's Impact on African-American Women and Girls. Along with that, edited 2 books that include the writings of her great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells, and has another essay in 400 Souls, a community history of African America from 1619 to 2019, which comes out next week, February 2nd. Duster will be in conversation with Rebecca Carroll, host of the podcast Come Through with Rebecca Carroll, and a cultural critic at WNYC, where she also develops and produces a broad array of multi-platform content and hosts live event series in the green space. Her book, Surviving the White Gaze, will be published next week as well on February 2nd. And Politics and Prose is hosting an event with her on February 9th. Let's give our guests a virtual round of applause.
Hey, hi. Just one quick note. I want to say I'm no longer at WNYC. After 5 years, I left in the fall because the aforementioned book has been optioned for a limited series television. I'll be adapting that. But that's just a side note. You, Michelle Duster, this is your publishing week. How does it feel?
Oh, it's exciting. There's a lot of activity, and so. I'm hoping that people are interested and inspired by the book, and it'll make a difference in people's lives, especially young people. That's what I'm really hoping.
That's an interesting thing that I want to put a pin in, young people. But before we get to the book, in doing some research for this conversation, I watched a YouTube recording of a talk you did for the Chicago Humanities Festival. And it was with Nicole Hannah-Jones, of course, the journalist who is known for her Twitter handle, Ida Bay Wells. And then also with Eve Ewing, who is the brilliant writer and scholar. And I was halfway through, you started talking about your own identity and how there had been a bit of a struggle for you to sort of create your identity in the shadow of your great-great-grandmother. And so I'm curious, because so many of us as Black women create identities through and around ancestral movement and the Black women who came before us, both biological and otherwise. And so tell me about the evolution of your own identity and what you took from your great-great-grandmother and what you distance yourself from.
Well, Ida B. the Queen is about my great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells. Ida was my grandmother's mother. And so I knew my grandmother very well. I spent a lot of time with her when I was growing up, but I never met Ida because she died 32 years before I was born. So I learned about her through research like everybody else does, looking at primary documents. I read her autobiography, which my grandmother edited and got published. And so for me, when I was growing up, Ida B. Wells was sort of a remote, kind of abstract concept to some extent, which I think, honestly, my other relatives were the same way to me. When I was 7, 8 years old and my mother would tell me stories about her father or her mother or other relatives, I was like, you're a kid, like they're older, it doesn't seem like it resonates in your life. So it wasn't until I was in my 20s, when I was around the same age that Ida was, when she started her activism work, that I realized how young she was when she actually got involved in these activities. For instance, she sued the Chesapeake, Ohio and Southwestern Railroad when they threw her off the ladies' car because she refused to move to the colored car. And so when I was 21 years old, I was like, I wasn't suing any railroads. So that's what made me realize how extraordinary some of the things that she did actually was.
And so what were you doing at 21?
I had graduated from college. I went to Dartmouth College, and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I knew that I wanted to work in a profession that was focused on producing positive images about African Americans, because I felt that there were not enough variety or not multidimensional enough stories being told about us, and I wanted to make an impact in that way. So I first started working in advertising as a copywriter at an all-Black agency, and then I segued into a variety of things, film. I worked in a lot of public history programs and was writing all the time on the side. And so I've had quite a journey, but the common thread is that I really wanted to be involved in creating positive and multidimensional images of my culture, my history.
But so going back to the question of, sort of mining or evolving your own identity in the context of this historical figure who is famous. I think in the talk you said, it became difficult because people wanted to talk to me about Ida B. Wells, and people wanted to talk to me about Ida B. Wells, and so on and so on. And so at what point do you say to folks, I am a descendant of Ida B. Wells, but I am not Ida B. Wells?
Well, I have learned over these decades that I have been involved in doing any kind of work that people want to attribute to Ida's influence, that it's fairly difficult for people to separate who I am from who Ida was. I think some people who have such admiration for Ida look at me as a tangible person that they can touch and feel and see and talk to as an extension of her. And so I just feel like with certain people in certain situations, I just go with it.
Right.
But some people can see the difference.
I think that's really exactly sort of at the core of it, right? Which is that you become this kind of proxy, right? To this person that people have decided already who she was and how important she was to this particular person. And so, not to belabor it, but I find it really interesting and fascinating how, you kind of have made it your life's work, not just to amplify voices from our culture, your history, but also to focus on her. So that work must feel very sort of a little bit double-edged, right? To sort of forge your path while also directing everybody to hers.
Right. It is challenging because I care. I want people to remember my great-grandmother. I want them to be inspired by her. I think that she was, obviously she was a trailblazing journalist and an anti-lynching crusader. She was a suffragist, a civil rights icon. She was a social worker. She was a teacher. She was one of the co-founders of the NAACP. I mean, the laundry list of accomplishments that she has are really almost overwhelming because that one person can do all that in one lifetime. And so I want her to get the credit that she deserves, because she was written out of the history books. You know, when you just say, for instance, the suffrage movement, you know, most of the people who tend to get credit for the suffrage movement are not my great grandmother. There are some other people, and it seems like there are only 5 people, you know, who were in the suffrage movement. So my great grandmother and other women who were involved in the suffrage movement need to be known. It needs to be more recognized that there were Black women in the suffrage movement. And so in order for me as a Black woman to work in a way that makes Black women visible, and my great grandmother was one of those women who was working in the trenches, working on this struggle, you know, I feel like I have no choice but to start with my family first and then expand out to other women. But my goal is to make sure that all of the women who were involved in these movements and did this kind of work get the credit and the recognition that they deserve.
And so to the point of getting recognition and getting due, right? Giving her flowers that she deserves, right? How do we know? I mean, there certainly a lot more people know who Ida B. Wells is now than 10 years ago or 15 years ago or 20 years ago. There are a lot of figures, as you said, particularly Black women, who have made so many contributions to this country in so many ways. But how do we know when the due has arrived?
I'm not really sure, because I mean, you know, there are a lot of people who obviously know who Ida B. Wells is, and I get a lot of that, people, you know, sort of gushing about how she's their shero and their mentor and their spiritual godmother and that, and then I meet people who've like never heard of her before. And so I'm like, how? How have you never heard of this person before? And this other person is like, you know, really like almost, you know, fangirl kind of stuff. Yeah. And so I think for one of my goals is to help a younger generation know who my great grandmother was, because I do think that unfortunately too many times in our just the way that people learn information, she's been left out, as well as, like I said, a whole lot of our contemporaries. I think that our history for Black Americans in general has been skimmed over way too much, you know, and it's almost like there are 3 things that happened, right? There was slavery, then there was the Civil War, then there was Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, and then Barack Obama. And I'm like, hello, a lot of other things happened in between that.
Yeah. I think that that's, you know, a very important point to make. And it brings me to this idea of the moment, right? It's a sort of auspicious and kind of suspect time for Black women in America. I say suspect, you know, because we've just seen Stacey Abrams become the most memed person in the history of memes. And of course, we have our first Black woman vice president, Black and South Asian. But a lot of the adulation feels kind of hollow and performative, right? What do you make of the sort of current state of affairs of Black women, and what do you think Ida would make of it?
I mean, which I think we are definitely having a moment as Black women in this country. I think that we have always known that we are we've been very much involved in grassroots organizing. We have a tradition of organizing, mostly a lot of it through churches, as we all know. And so we've been a force for a long time, but I think right now, suddenly people are actually realizing it. It's almost like a hidden secret that we've known all along. And so it's refreshing for us as a community to be taken seriously as an actual force that can affect change. As far as what my great grandmother Ida B. Wells would think, I'm guessing based on the way that she lived her life. I mean, she was involved in the suffrage movement. She was involved in the civil rights activism at her time. And so my guess is that she would be pleased to see the progress that women have made in particular, because she was 58 years old when the 19th Amendment was passed, which gave technically women the right to vote. And then she actually ran for state senate, which was really bold in 1930. So now here we are 90 years later, and we have the first Black South Asian woman as vice president. So one could argue either way. Either it's like great progress, or like, why did it take so long for 90 years afterwards? And actually 100 years after women gained the right to vote.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting way to kind of springboard into evolution, revolution, the arc, the arc towards justice, all these kinds of things for those of us who talk and write about particularly race and Blackness in America, and this idea of how we go from here to here. And I think what gets lost oftentimes is what your great-great-grandmother was dealing with at the time, and then what we're dealing with right now. And I'm thinking about, the Women's March. I'm thinking about the idea of feminism and how there is still this friction between white women and Black women about feminism and what that actually means. And I wonder if you have any sense about your great-great-grandmother's relationships with white feminists.
Well, I think she had sort of a duplicitous relationship, because when she was working in Illinois, she actually worked with white women in Illinois in a couple of organizations that were around the women's rights and voting rights. So she did have white allies. I mean, there were two women, white women, Virginia Brooks and Belle Squire, who helped her found the Alfred Suffrage Club. And in fact, when she marched in the 1913 parade, where Black women were asked to march in the back of the parade, those two women actually volunteered to march with her in the back. But then she ultimately marched with them in the front, because she inserted herself in the front of the parade. But when I've read about that, I was struck by how these women were actually, like, for real allies. And so my great-grandmother seemed to have positive relationships with certain white women who actually were in the trenches and willing to help. But then there were also women who she disagreed with. So I think she kind of looked at people as individuals and sort of assessed, where their heads were, and if she could work with them or not.
But so are they allies if they offer to march in the back rather than bring her up to the front?
I mean, I took it as them deciding that they were going to be with her. I mean, I don't know if they could have. I wasn't there at the actual meeting, but what I read was that there was discussion about should she go to the back of the parade? What would the Illinois delegation do as a delegation? How were they all going to, manage this? And in the midst of this discussion, that was one of the ideas that came up was, well, we'll be with you. So I don't know if, if they ever said, well, come with us, but for those particular two white women to volunteer to be in solidarity with Ida, I just thought, that's my own personal opinion, I thought that was a nice gesture on their part. But she ultimately, in the famous picture that you see of her at the march, she is in between those two women.
And so, bringing it back to you for a minute, and I don't know if you went to the Women's March or whatnot, but if you were in a similar situation today, and of course there was all of this drama around the Women's March and the voices that were represented and not represented, but if two white feminists said to you, I will march with you in the back, what would you say?
I probably would do the same thing that my great-grandmother did, which was she initially agreed, and then the day of the parade, they couldn't find her. And so I guess they gave up trying to find her in the back. And so they went, and assumed their places with the Illinois delegation. And then my great-grandmother, from what I understand, walked along the side of the parade, and then she kind of jumped out from the crowd and inserted herself into the front. And it was in between those two particular women. So, I mean, it's hard because today, we have 100 years more of progress than there even was then. So I would be very indignant if somebody made that request of me.
Right, right. You, of course, as you've said, there's just this laundry list of things that she, I mean, it's almost unreal, the things that she accomplished and the way in which she conducted her life and the way, her sense of integrity is just profound. But of those things that she did, you know, a rabble rouser of sorts, and an agitator, and a feminist, and a writer, a journalist, and what is the thing, if you can pinpoint, that most speaks to you?
Honestly, what most speaks to me is how she had a business acumen, which is what is something that most people don't refer to as a businesswoman.
Right.
When I look at how savvy she was, when they asked her, two men asked her to first edit the Memphis Free Speech, they came to her with that offer, and she basically negotiated and was like, well, I'll be the editor as long as I am part owner of the newspaper. So she made that as a condition to becoming the editor. And I'm just like, wow, that is so amazing that she felt that she needed to have ownership of the newspaper and not just as an employee. And then again and again, I mean, when she, after her friends were killed in 1892, they were lynched because they owned a grocery store that rivaled a white-owned grocery store. And she advocated for Black people in Memphis to boycott the streetcars and to boycott white-owned businesses. So again, to me, that's that business acumen, or that sort of economic power. She understood that. And again, when she went up to New York City, and T. Thomas Fortune asked her again to, well, he asked her to write for the New York Age, and also, from what I understand, asked her for the subscription list for the Memphis Free Speech. And she was like, well, I'll give you the list in exchange for part ownership of the New York Age. And so again, I'm like, whoa, you know, she was this tough negotiator, and she looked out for her own interest. And there's several other examples that kind of struck me as far as her being savvy.
Where did that moxie come from?
Well, based on what I learned about her parents, specifically her father, was that I think she got some of that moxie from him, because he, after the 15th Amendment was passed and Black men got the right to vote in the 1870s, her father took full advantage of that and just, you know, went full force into being an enthusiastic voter. And in fact, he voted one way that was the opposite of his former enslaver had asked him to vote. And as a result, he lost his, he was a carpenter, and so he was locked out of his tools and his house. So then he was like, went and got some more tools and found another place to live. And so I think, I mean, what I surmise is that Ida, watching that willingness to stand up for what you believe and not be intimidated by somebody else and not let anybody else control you, and be willing to suffer consequences for standing up for what you believe, I think that made an impression on her.
You also write a little bit in the book about sacrifices that she had to make. What were those sacrifices?
Well, I mean, the really big sacrifice that most people who know her story about is that she lost her printing press, and her life was threatened when she continuously wrote articles about what happened with her friends who were lynched. But she also was uncovering the false narrative that was being told at the time that Black men were violating white women. And so she exposed and uncovered the fact that that was not really the case. Too many instances where innocent Black people had been killed, and or the liaisons that actually happened between Black men and white women were consensual. And that was a volatile thing to even suggest. So the people found that to be unacceptable, and they just had to get rid of her. So that's what happened. That was a huge sacrifice. She also lost her teaching job when she criticized the Memphis school system for the inequalities, the racial inequalities. So time and time again, she spoke the truth, and then something ended up happening where she would lose something, but she just kept going.
That moxie, right, that you talk about, and standing up for yourself. And it makes me think of the stereotypes that we as Black women live with. You know, we're probably the most stereotyped demographic in the country. You know, the mammy, the Jezebel, the matriarch, the sapphire. And if Ida might have felt that she was being categorized in any of those ways, even before we had the language for it.
I mean, she definitely expressed, especially in, I mean, her diary is the only sort of private thoughts that I am able to access. And she did express feeling that she was a very opinionated person, and sort of outspoken and uncompromising. And so she knew that she was viewed as difficult. And she expressed, I mean, when she was writing her diary, she was in her mid-20s, so still fairly young, and I guess trying to navigate herself through the world. And she seemed very self-conscious of that, trying to be ladylike, but then she had a temper and she would express herself, and so it seemed like she was almost in conflict with herself, of like wanting to fit into these expectations of ladylike and womanhood, but then she had an aggressive personality, and she knew that it was considered difficult or unladylike for other people, but she couldn't. I don't know. It just seemed like she was kind of torn within herself on that she couldn't fit into that expectation.
Mm-hmm. She felt torn that she couldn't, and also that she didn't want to?
It seemed like it's based on what she wrote, it seemed like she tried to, kind of to present herself a certain way so that she would fit in with what the expectations were, but then just could not, because I guess that was just so her, that she couldn't help herself, and so she ended up, I think eventually she became comfortable with it and stopped trying, but she seemed kind of like anguished. That was my interpretation when I was reading her words.
So you've written a lot, you've talked a lot, you have, worked a lot to elevate and amplify her. Why this one? What makes this one special to you?
Well, I mean, this book is different from other books about Ida B. Wells, the other biographies that are already out in the world, because first of all, it's nonlinear. And so my thoughts when it came to constructing it that way was to sort of mimic how I learned about her, because that, I think most people's families, when they're telling the stories of their family members, it's not like, once upon a time this person was born and then tell everything till they died, right? It's more like it'll come in sprinkles and moments. And so I thought that would be an interesting, different way to tell the story. I also wanted to tie Ida's story to the larger story of the African American 400 years of resistance and progress, and help explain, or hopefully people can see how she fits in to that sort of timeline, and that she wasn't the first to resist, the challenges of our country. And after she's passed away, there have been people after her who have continued on with this struggle. And so I think it might give people sort of a bigger context of who she was and how she fits in, and hopefully inspire people to see how they can fit in to this never-ending, continuing story towards progress and equality and justice in our country.
And so how specifically did she help you realize how or where you could fit in?
Well, I think the main thing that I was always told in our family by my grandmother, my grandmother was Ida's daughter. What my grandmother always emphasized the importance of education, that she would tell us, like, once you have your education, that's something nobody can take away from you. And so it was like a de-emphasis on material things. Like, you know, what's inside your head is yours, and nobody can tell you that you are not qualified, that you are not talented and smart. And so there was a strong emphasis on self-esteem, I guess, if you want to call it that, and believing that your voice and your ability to express yourself is important. In my family, we were always sort of taught how to construct arguments, and, like, you know, even at the dinner table, when you want to say, you know, you want to go to your friend's house, you know, for their birthday party, it's like, okay, why? You have to construct an argument here, you know, what are the pros and cons, and, you know, what are the benefits, and you know, so even little things like that, like, we were always encouraged to be able to express ourselves, and to believe that what our ideas were valid, and come up with evidence. And so I think, you know, those are the kind of things that are probably passed down, and that inspire me to always think that my needs, my way of thinking about things, my talent is important, and nobody is lesser than me, and nobody's more than me.
So you mentioned sort of placing Ida in this larger resistance arc, and so you mentioned a lot of other folks, from Du Bois to Ella Baker and A. Philip Randolph, and then more contemporary figures like Colin Kaepernick and Lucy McBain. And what do you think is the common thread of these figures who you have highlighted alongside your great grandmother? Yes.
Well, there were different aspects of her and the kind of work that she did, that when I was thinking about the strategies that she used in her fight for you know, equality and justice, certain people kind of popped out to my mind of it, for me, who I think you know, is kind of continuing in that realm. So, for instance, when I was thinking about how sometimes people work alone, like sometimes you have to stand alone in order to make a point, and you might lose something when you are standing by yourself in this in what you believe in. And so Colin Kaepernick, you know, seemed like that was the first person that I thought of that's more, you know, current. He was by himself. He's the first one, you know, who took a knee. Now, obviously, other people followed, but for him to be willing to take that stand or take that knee, knowing, I'm sure he knew that there would be potential repercussions, and he did it anyway. And that reminded me of how my great grandmother, with the speaking out against the school system, for instance. I mean, she was by herself. It was only her voice, and she lost her job. The same thing with Muhammad Ali when he took a stand against the war. You know, I'm sure knew that there would be repercussions, but he was strong in his convictions, and he was not intimidated, and he ended up, you know, losing several years of his career at the peak of his career for that. And, you know, the same thing with Tommy Smith and John Carlos. I mean, so there were certain people, and hopefully people agree with me that these people took a stand on their own, and ended up having consequences that affected their careers. So, there were other examples that I thought of as far as like, how many other people were, surveilled by the FBI. And I think that's interesting when you think about what's going on today. This idea that certain things cannot be tracked or surveilled or kind of questioned. When we think about just what happened a few weeks ago in Washington, D.C., how could this intelligence not know certain things, but then they could come up with 10,000 pages on Malcolm X. So it's just interesting how certain things and certain people or certain movements in this country are considered dangerous. While, other situations are not considered dangerous. So I was kind of exploring those sort of arguments or just tying these things together.
So it's not interesting, it's racist, right? I mean, should we just call it what it is? I mean, I think that's something that I'm fascinated by as well, is just like the language that we use to talk about these things and our history and repercussions and sacrifices. And will we ever live in a time when actually believing we are human doesn't come with sacrifice and repercussions?
I guess we'll have to find out. I mean, I was feeling a sense of hope a few years ago. And things have been a little tempered in the past few years. And so now I'm just still hoping that I will live long enough to see that day. I'm not sure. I don't know if that will happen, because I just think there's so many barriers that we still need to overcome when it comes to attitudes. And that's one thing that, is just an actual reality, that we cannot legislate humanity.
Right.
You can't legislate attitudes or thoughts. You can have all the laws in the world, but what's inside of people is not something that you can legislate. So unfortunately, I think, when I saw 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago, all I could think about was how many of the people there are descendants of the people that my great-grandmother was fighting against.
Sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. Direct line. And I think that, hope ebbs and flows, and I think that question needs to be more and more centered, which is that you can't legislate what's inside of people, but how do you evolve what's inside of people?
I mean, I really honestly feel the only way that that change can actually happen is to start when people are young. If you start when they're 2 and 3 years old, because children do not care. They don't care. They will just, run up to anybody that's their little size. They see somebody their eye level, and they will just start to play. And then the adults jump in and say, no, don't play with that person, or don't touch that person, or whatever. But if you leave the kids alone, they don't care. I don't think they even have a concept of race. So to me, the world would be such a different place if everybody, had the same attitude that 3-year-olds do.
Yeah, though we could also look at that as being problematic as well, like not thinking about race at all. I mean, it's sort of too late to do that, right?
Well, when I say not thinking about race, I mean, obviously children see differences, but they don't decide, I'm going to talk to this person or not talk to this person because of the way they look. They just share their candy or share their toy. And they might see differences, but I don't think they see the differences as better or not. It's just different. And, they might ask questions, but they don't place a value. I don't know how 3-year-olds think, but I'm guessing that they, based on how they're just so innocent. And I think that hatred is taught.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to open it up to our guests here. Let's see. Do you have a favorite passage in your book that we should look out for?
Oh my gosh. Oh, do I have a favorite passage? There's one moment that really kind of, I really enjoyed, which was when she confronted, I don't know what page it's on, but when she confronted a pastor who she had heard was making comments that might have negatively affected or reflected on her. And she went to his house with 5 of her friends and confronted him about what she heard that he said, and then demanded an apology. And she already had written his apology for him and told him to not only apologize to her, but to say it in public in his church. And so to me, I just laughed out loud when when I read that, because I was like, whoa, she's like a don't mess with me kind of person. And I'm going to not just hear about this, but I'm coming to your face. And I'm going to confront you, and you are going to apologize in public.
Your house.
Yeah. So to me, that kind of summarized her personality.
Do you think about, this is me, do you ever think about talking with her? Do you ever have conversations in your mind?
Not really. I mean, there are times when I just will kind of wonder if she has any idea of what's going on today when it comes to the programs and the projects that are being made to honor her. And I just feel like, kind of like, hey, we got your back. We're making sure that you get
Right.
the credit that you deserve. And one thing I want to mention when we talk about women being left out of history, I do feel that there is a difference between how Ida has been left out or portrayed in certain ways compared to her male contemporaries. And I think there is a difference. And so in addition to there being racial differences, there are gender differences. And that's one thing that I really want to, in my own way, contribute to having women get more credit.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. For those who want to follow in Ida B. Wells's footsteps, what are some things you think she would recommend for us today, both for people starting out and for those of us who are already experienced organizers?
I mean, so my great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells, did a lot of different things. I think she just tried different strategies. As my dad used to say, not about Ida, but just in general, like, just throw spaghetti against the wall and see what sticks. And I mean, I think that was a little bit of her strategy of like, well, I'm going to write about, I'm going to use journalism as a form of activism, and I'm going to write about these atrocities and document it and try the United States in the court of public opinion, because she knew that from her own experience that trying to get justice through the courts was not necessarily going to work. So, appeal to a moral consciousness or an economic consciousness. So, she documented injustice, using facts, indisputable facts, which people can do today. Mm-hmm. That's what a lot of street journalists are doing that. We can say that what happened with the filming of George Floyd's murder is along the lines of what my great-grandmother was doing, where you're documenting indisputable fact and then, blasting it out and let the court of public opinion, sort of decide what they want to do about it. Also, she advocated for boycotts, as I mentioned, so boycotting anything. I mean, today we do this. I don't know. Sometimes I feel like we don't have the same stamina, because we might boycott something for like 2 weeks. But I mean, we need to boycott, like for a year.
That's real. Or more than a year. That's real. Right. Absolutely. The fatigue sets in because it's just such, I mean, when there isn't a pandemic, the fatigue sets in. But on top of that, this pandemic, I think has brought people lower in terms of stamina and hope and activism and organizing and whatnot. This next one is a great question. When you meet people who have never heard of Ida B. Wells, what do you usually identify as some of the top reasons people should know about her?
I basically, say that she was a very famous journalist who fought against, who exposed the realities of lynching, through chronicling the facts. She was a civil rights activist who fought for, freedom and equality in our country. She also fought for women to have the rights to vote, and she was a social worker.
Do you ever tell people who don't know who she is to question why they don't know who she is?
No, I think, unfortunately, depending on where people live and how they grew up, it was not included in the school curriculum. And unless they had parents who were also knowledgeable about her, then the possibility of learning about her is lesser than it is in certain environments. So, I mean, for instance, there are people who are in Mississippi, her home state, who didn't hear about her until they were in college or something like that. So I think, just like an example, right? The Tulsa, Oklahoma riot. How many people grew up in Tulsa and didn't know about the riot that happened in their own city? So sometimes history is buried on purpose, or there's like this silence. And so I think it's not unusual for people to not know certain information. It's sad, and I think it's more of a reflection of our school system than it is on that individual.
Right. I mean, I only ask that because I feel like we should be interrogating that school system that didn't teach it.
I agree.
Okay, so here's a question for both of us. Do either of you have a young modern day Ida B. Wells that you look up to and would like to give a shout out to? You can go first. It's your night.
When you say young, I'm not sure what age that is.
Whatever age you want it to be.
I mean, I think, as I wrote in the book, Ida B. the Queen, I think that Nicole Hannah-Jones of the New York Times magazine, I mean, she started the Ida B. Wells Society for Investigative Reporting, which I think is, following in the footsteps of Ida B. Wells as far as, investigative journalism, but she's also training people to have the skill set to become, so there can't be the excuse that we can't find any qualified people. It's like, okay, we're training. We're building a pipeline of journalists. I think that there are some journalists that we see right now, Black female journalists, that are covering the White House, and we're covering the Trump administration, who are amazing journalists who were attacked several times by the former president, during these press conferences. And so to me, they're very admirable as far as being, strong journalists and standing, very confident. So, yeah.
I'm very keen to let historic figures be themselves and to not put pressure on young people to reflect or be anybody other than who they are. But I do think that every Black girl born into the world has the potential to have the force that your great-great-grandmother had. Great or great?
It's one great. She was my grandmother's mother.
And how wonderful that we have her work and her legacy and her life in the world. So thank you. Thank you for this beautiful book. Thank you, everybody who came out. And that does it for us.
Oh, okay.
Quick questions before, one of our questions we always ask authors before we go. What are you two reading at the moment?
Oh, there's so much good stuff. Michelle, you want to go first?
Well, yeah, I mean, honestly, I am reading 400 Souls, which might be a little self-serving because I'm in it, but I never even knew who else was included, who the other writers were for that. So having the chance to read that, I feel like it's just a brilliant collection of different voices, and to tell the story of our history in a very unique way. So I'm really, really enjoying it.
So I just read Ida B. the Queen. And I'm speed reading Chani Nicholas's book, You Were Born for This, because I'm doing an IG thing with her tomorrow. And then I'm rereading Nicole Chung's book, All You Can Ever Know, because we're going to be doing an event next week. But I have constantly piles of books around me, and I feel comforted by books if I'm not able, even if I'm not able to read all of them.
Yep, I totally understand that feeling of so many books,
Yep.
so little time, right? Well, we'd like to, on the behalf of Politics and Prose, we'd like to thank you both for being here. Thanks for doing this amazing event with us. And those of you watching, thank you for tuning in and supporting the bookstore. Remember that you can purchase Ida B. the Queen from politics-prose.com, along with signing up for Rebecca's event next week on February 9th. You can also find 400 Souls on our website and Surviving the White Gaze. And I wish you all a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.